Welcome, everyone. While people are joining the Zoom, I just want to take a few seconds to give some directions in Spanish because this webinar will be in Spanish and English. So I would just like to address that for a few seconds. So I'll switch to Spanish now. Bienvenidos a todos a esta nuevo episodio de la
Welcome all
serie
to
de
this
webinars
new
de
episode of the webinar series on sciences. This webinar will be available in Spanish and English. The regional language shall be English. If you pay attention in the lower part of Zoom, you can find the option of interpretation. In some screens, it might be an icon like a globe, or you can find it in the more option. You can hear Felix, who's going to be the interpreter, who's going to be the Spanish voice for Morgan and myself. So let us hope that you can all switch to Spanish if you need it. I'll go back to English. That will be the official language of this webinar.
So thanks for that, for those few seconds. Welcome to Manomet's Small Seed webinar series. We've been here recently for another seminar, but now we're having another topic, really exciting. We're really happy to have everyone here. Just joining in the chat. You guys are getting ahead. I haven't even told you to start saying where you're from yet, and you're already very exciting in the chat. So my name is Andrea Ferreira. I'm Manomet Science Communications Manager, and I'll be your host today. For this webinar, we have AI and sound in the Arctic, studying shorebirds on the Alaskan tundra using passive acoustics and machine learning. And our expert for that topic, it's Morgan Ziegenhorn, research associate for data science and acoustic ecology at Manomet. They recently joined our team, but have been working with us very closely in collaboration as a postdoctoral researcher. Morgan obtained their PhD in oceanography with studies focusing on passive acoustic monitoring in toothed whales in Hawaii. So it is about shorebirds, but she has experience in so many other exciting animals. So now some quick housekeeping notes before Morgan starts. This session is being recorded. Also, please share your questions in the Q&A box that you'll find again on the Zoom app, and we'll answer those questions at the end. So now everyone can go in the chat and say where they are zooming in from today. I see so many messages already. I know Morgan is in California. I'm in Paraguay, South America. So this is really exciting. And now, without further ado, welcome, Morgan. Please, the virtual floor is yours to enlighten us with science.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. It's really cool to see where everyone's coming in from, and also a little intimidating. So I hope you have a good time with this. As Andrea mentioned, I'll be talking today about my work using AI for passive acoustic monitoring research in the Arctic. And I'm working at Manomet now, but this is a really collaborative effort with a variety of groups. So I've put some other logos on this slide so that we can acknowledge them as well. I've got colleagues at the University de Moncton, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Environment and Climate Change Canada, and a lot of other places. And I'm really thankful for all of their work on this project. So I wanted to make sure that I also mentioned them. So a little bit about me, although Andrea covered some of this already. My name is Morgan. I am an acoustic ecologist, and I'm based in California. I've been doing passive acoustic research and studying sounds in the environment for about the past decade now, including during my graduate research, which focused on whales and dolphins at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. I graduated from Scripps in 2022, and since then, I've been working with Manomet scientists since 2023, studying sound in the Alaskan Arctic, which is on the map in sort of shown with the yellow arrow here. So this is a map of the Arctic Circle. You can see a lot of the countries that contribute land mass in the Arctic, and then this yellow arrow is showing the part of Alaska that's within the Arctic Circle. So the research we're doing is sort of focused on this really northern piece of Alaska. And I have been working directly for Manomet since November of last year, so I'm really excited to be part of the official Manomet team. As an acoustic ecologist, the main tool that I've used for the past decade, like I mentioned, is passive acoustic monitoring, which is the process of passively recording sounds in the environment. And this slide has a couple of photos from deploying acoustic equipment in the Arctic specifically that really highlight what a difference a few days can make up there weather-wise. It can be a really different experience depending on the weather as far as how fun it is to be out there putting out equipment. But it's always at least a little bit fun, I think. The data we collect by passively listening in this way can be used to understand soundscapes, animal behaviors and movement, background noise, and many other topics, and crucially, all with really minimal interference to animals and their environment, which is something that I like a lot about it. And in my work with Manomet, I'm primarily using passive acoustic monitoring to monitor animals specifically rather than other types of sound, although we do pick up other types of sounds. And generally, sound is a useful way to monitor animals because animals use sound in a lot of ways. So a few examples of how animals use sound with some Arctic animals in particular are for foraging, so searching for food. Beluga whales, for example, use echolocation clicks to find fish, squid, and other prey animals. Animals also use sound for navigation, so understanding and moving through their environment. In the Arctic, bowhead whales use their calls to assess how thick sea ice is so that they can find areas that are thin enough to break through and breathe, and also so that they can determine whether there's enough clearance for them to swim underneath. On land, a lot of birds use communication or use sound for communication, rather. So displays to impress other animals or calls to keep in contact over distance. And for examples here, I have a lot of the beautiful birds that we see on the Arctic tundra in the summer, including Lapland longspurs, dunlins, semi-palmated sandpipers, and long-billed dowitchers. All of these species have really cool acoustic displays that are related to mating and establishing territory, and some also make other calls for pairs to keep in contact. And I want to shout out a collaborator of mine named Pablo Petracchi, who took these bird photos and a lot of other bird photos that are in this presentation a couple of summers ago in Utqiagvik, Alaska. So thank you, Pablo, for the photos. He might be on the call. And I appreciate that he's allowed me to continue to use his great pictures. And then finally, animals use sound for predator response. So things like alarm calls. A lot of species of birds have alarm calls that are used when they're stressed or scared or agitated by the presence of predators. American golden plovers, like the ones shown on the slide here, are a really good example of this in the tundra. They have a really specific alarm call that you often hear in response to you wandering around if you're up there. So in the Arctic, Manomet and our collaborators are primarily using sound recording as a new way to monitor shorebirds specifically as a part of the PRISM project. And PRISM is the Program for Regional and International Shorebird Monitoring. And traditionally, PRISM surveys have been observation-based, so you're on plots and you're visually looking for birds. Those have been active in the Arctic since 2001, and they use a double sampling method, which includes some intensive surveys where you spend a long time on plots, but also a large selection of randomly selected plots where you're only spending 90 minutes on plots. So you have to be pretty quick at visually identifying the birds. And the overall goal is to estimate shorebird abundance using those surveys. For the acoustic surveys, we've only been doing them since 2022. And along with the benefits of being low disturbance to birds, one cool thing about the acoustic work is that we can also put the recorders out on plots and leave them throughout all of June and July to record data across the full summer. And so you get a longer picture of what's going on at each plot, which is really cool. But again, the goal here is to estimate shorebird abundance. And I'm going to get into some of the things that are difficult about that towards the end of the talk. And in my work, I lead the processing and analysis of the acoustic data set, and also auxiliary data collection and fieldwork related to estimating abundance. But before I talk about the data we're collecting and how AI helps us process it and the really exciting insights that we're already learning from that work, I want to play a short game to introduce you to some of the Arctic's coolest sounds. So I'm going to play a sound, and I'd like you to guess what it is. There are no bad guesses. You can type it in the chat. I've got it up so I'll be able to see. And here is the first one. so please let me know if you can't hear it. All right, one more time. All right, I'm seeing a few guesses. I see seal, I'm seeing dog, grouse. Oh, someone did put a right answer. So yes, to a couple people put snowy owl. It is a snowy owl, or ukpik, which is the traditional Inupiat name for this species. A lot of the pictures here are from the city of Utqiagvik, which I mentioned before, in northern Alaska, which is a primarily Inupiat community. So I've also put their words for the animals on the slides, although I will not be attempting to pronounce all of them. All right, next sound. I'm seeing on this one that those who've spent time in the Arctic absolutely know who this one is. So yes, this is a sandpiper. Specifically, it is the semi-palmated sandpiper. They make this call during a really cool display where they sort of go up in the air and then they really high up and they just sort of fly around in little circles and cover distance. And really impressively, they can do this for minutes on end. And they're such a small bird, and it's really great. So good guesses on that one. Sorry if this one's a little quiet. I think it might be a little quiet. A ghost. That one's a bit of a trick because it's not a bird. That is a bearded seal vocalization. So we don't hear that on our recorders, but they're up there in the Arctic making that noise. That is a male courtship display. Again, they can do it for a really long time, and it sort of conveys to other animals lung capacity and male fitness. And so that's theorized at least why they do that. It's a very cool call, I think. Uh, I do see a right answer. So yes, good job to those that put beluga. That is a beluga. Belugas are sometimes called the canaries of the ocean. Fun fact. Those are whistles, which are primarily social calls between individual whales. And then I think this is our last one. taking a couple of guesses. A couple of people's pets are not enjoying this game. My pets did not enjoy when I made this game either, so I sympathize with your pets. Uh, so that is a loon. Yes, it is the Pacific loon specifically, which is my favorite of the loons, I think, that we get up there in the summer. They're really just so beautiful in breeding plumage. So that is the end of our game. Thanks for playing along with us, and you're all qualified to review acoustic data now, so expect an email from me about how we could use you as volunteers. So from PRISM, we've collected a lot of data in these past few years that contain many of the species that we just heard, albeit not the marine mammals. And this map is from a recent publication, which shows our recording locations up in the Alaskan Arctic in 2022 on the top and in 2023 on the left. This is just to show that we're collecting data from a lot of sites. At all of these sites, there's one of these little recorders put out. And additionally, at all of these sites, we did observational PRISM surveys, so we have both types of data, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And there were an additional approximately 100 recorders put out in 2024, and the same will be true this summer. And recording like this results in a lot of data, and it comes to us unlabeled. So we don't know what species are in it when we get it back from our field sites. This image is a spectrogram of our data that shows time on the x-axis, frequency on the y-axis, and color is the intensity of the sound, so how loud the sounds are. We just listen to sounds to identify them, but it's actually really common for acousticians to visualize acoustic data like this to look for signals of interest. And once you've heard sounds a few times, you can identify them visually without having to listen to them, which is generally faster. So I can tell you, because I've looked at this data a lot, and also I made the slides, that this long call here is a Dunlin, and this little short call is a Lapland longspur. And that's pretty quick for me to do with the experience that I have. But it takes me a lot longer to review this much data, which would maybe take me a day or two of work, depending on how complex the species that are in it are. And this is just the amount that we collect from a single recorder on a single day. And in actuality, as of 2025, we had 73,500 hours of recordings, so about 3,000 times as much data as is shown on this slide. Or alternatively, if that doesn't work for you, 49,000 watch-throughs of the 2001 classic Shrek. Going through this much data manually is already impossible, even within just a few years of starting recording at these sites. And this is where AI can help us. So specifically, we're using machine learning models called neural networks to automatically detect and classify animal sounds in our data set. And while commercial AI is relatively new, scientists have been using machine learning for several decades, and a lot of what is now referred to as AI would have been called machine learning just like 5 years ago, which is why you may sometimes see both terms. Conceptually, neural networks are structured after neurons in the human brain. You can kind of see an example of that on the right here. So different model nodes will fire depending on what you input. Here, a picture of George Washington, and that makes different nodes fire so that you get to this specific output node, which is George. If you have ever used Merlin Bird ID or iNaturalist, then you have also used this kind of machine learning model, because those are also based on neural networks. And I want to emphasize that the model that we have built and these other Merlin and iNaturalist models are AI, but they're non-generative. So unlike ChatGPT or other commercially available AI tools, these models don't generate content. And though they sometimes have false positives, they're not subject to creating false information or hallucinating in the way that generative AI tools can. And also, they're really small scale. So the models are nowhere near the size of the underlying models or data of commercial AI, which means they don't have the same scale of environmental impact as those larger tools do. So the model that we've created for the Arctic data is called Arctic SoundsNet, and it was built off of an existing model, BirdNet, that was built and maintained by Cornell and also the Chemnitz Chemnitz Institute of Technology in Germany. Their model recognizes over 5,000 species of birds, but we found that it didn't work very well for Arctic species when we used it on its own. And generally, if a neural network doesn't recognize the species that you need it to recognize very well, then you have to collect more data to train it on, which we call training data. You use that to develop the tool. You assess how the tool performs on ground truth data, which is just data that you feed into the model where you know what species are calling and when, so you can see whether the model is getting things correct or wrong. And then you can keep tweaking your model until you're satisfied with its performance and you have a final tool. And I wanted to highlight this piece because developing the training data set and the ground truth data set is a human effort. It requires significant work from really talented birders, such as Shiloh Schulte at Manomet, who is an extremely enthusiastic part of this process. And also no one could deploy acoustic recorders faster. So he was really instrumental in getting this work off the ground. It's just one of the many projects at Manomet that Shiloh was crucial for it. And so I wanted to acknowledge that. I don't know that we would have Arctic SoundsNet in the way that we have it right now if it wasn't for all of Shiloh's effort. And so using our method for developing Arctic SoundsNet that I walked us through a little bit, the final model that we've developed can identify the following 12 species of shorebirds that are common in the Alaskan Arctic. And in addition to these species, 8 other passerines, so songbirds, 3 loons, 3 geese, 6 seabirds, 7 other biotic groups, so other animals, including Arctic fox, and 3 other abiotic groups, which are things like trucks and planes and rain. And with Arctic SoundsNet, we can classify the 24 hours of data we saw on the previous screen in less than an hour. So it makes a huge difference, and it allows me to focus my time on valuable data analyses instead of spending years doing data processing. And so I'm going to run through a couple of things that we've learned so far in the analyses that we've done. So one example of something that we've worked on so far is comparing species presence at prism plots between our traditional visual surveys and the acoustic approach. And on the previous map, I showed all of those plots where we're collecting data and mentioned that we were collecting both types of data. So what we did here was compare encounter rates, which is the number of plots where a species was present divided by the total number of plots we surveyed for a bunch of species of shorebirds between the two methods. So when did the acoustic data detect a species versus when did our visual data say that a species was on plots? Generally, we found with this that acoustic encounter rates, which are the blue bars here, are higher for most species than visual encounter rates. And a good example of this is the long-billed dowitchers. You can see that in both regions, which are the different hues of the colors, the green bars are much lower than the blue bars. And where this is true for species, it's almost certainly related to the fact that we have an extended deployment period for the acoustic equipment. So we have 2 months to detect the species rather than 90 minutes. And that means that we detected more, or in using that, we detected more animals than we would have visually. But some species are still more easily detected visually. So phalaropes are slightly more common in the visual record. That's these 2 species here. And you can see on the plot that the green bars are both a little higher than the blue bars. This is likely because phalaropes are fairly quiet, and so the detection range around the acoustic equipment for them is small, which is something I'll talk about more in a few minutes. But it's also true that there are some species that weren't in our training data that were detected visually, which is kind of a different issue. So whimbrel here were detected visually in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, but we didn't pick them up acoustically, and that's because our model isn't trained to recognize whimbrel calls right now. And so it doesn't, even if they're present in the acoustic data, we're not classifying them, and so we can't tell that they're there. So that's kind of an ongoing thing to work on. Recently as well, I've been working on describing temporal patterns in acoustic behavior in more detail, which is another really cool thing that we can do with 24-hour data collection over a long period. So this figure is showing modeled acoustic detections for each hour of day on the x-axis for Dunlin, pectoral sandpipers, and phalaropes, and during different time periods. So the most left-hand column is across the full breeding season, and then the other columns are during the pre-nesting period, the nesting period, and the post-hatch period. And asterisks indicate statistically significant models. So generally, we found that daily acoustic behavior varies with the species we consider and also with breeding status. So across the breeding season, what's going on acoustically throughout the day differs. For Dunlin and pectoral sandpipers, it's interesting because during the pre-nesting period, you can see that there's no relationship to time of day. So they're really acoustically active regardless of time of day, and that's the period of time when they're most acoustically active. So when they're really active in the early season, when they're doing displays and trying to attract mates, there's no daily pattern in their calling behavior. But later in the season, when their acoustic activity dies down a bit, there's this really distinct behavioral pattern where there's a dip in acoustic activity in the afternoon. And in general, we found that where there is a pattern, that dip in the afternoon is consistent across species. And that is likely driven by high wind speeds locally to where this data was collected, which is really interesting because it means that in other areas where the wind patterns are different, we might see a really different time of day pattern in when birds are calling, or we also might not see any pattern at all. So it shows that there's a lot of complexity involved in what time of day birds sing, and there's a lot that we can of interesting behavioral information that we can get from acoustic data. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about what we're still working on. So way back in the beginning of my presentation, I mentioned that the key aspect of PRISM is that we want to estimate species densities. And that's fairly complex with acoustic data. So here's an example showing our recorder in the middle and some birds making noise around the recorder. And in the image, you can see the birds, but actually in the acoustic data, we just have the acoustic signals. We don't know how many birds or what species. So with Arctic SoundsNet, we're able to detect these calls and we're able to classify them to species relatively easily. And that's a great first step. But converting that into the actual density estimates is more difficult. And it has a couple of key steps that I'm going to run through. So the first step here is to convert the number of detections, which as I mentioned, we have from Arctic SoundsNet, to the density of detections, which requires us to know how big of an area we're surveying. And then in order to convert that to a number of individuals, we have to have a sense of how often an individual bird calls. So even if we know how many detections we have, we can only convert that to how many birds we're listening to if we know how often an individual bird produces sound. So we call that a Q rate. And the equations for these, for determining density in this way are actually a lot more complex than this, but I've simplified them for the purposes of going through this talk. And those were developed by Dr. Alison Johnston at the University of St. Andrews. We've been working together on figuring this out. So with visual data, some of this is a lot simpler because you know the area you've surveyed and you know how many individuals you found because you were visually looking at them. But with acoustic data, both of these pieces of information are fairly hard to get. And the acoustic survey range, so the survey area, depends on how far away you can hear birds, which means that it depends on how loud different species are. And we actually don't know that for most species of birds. There are only about 50 species of birds anywhere with published records of loudness, and none of those are Arctic species. So a couple of summers ago, we took this little recorder that's shown on the screen there, and I went up and recorded loudness of a bunch of birds. And with that, we've been able to contribute an additional 17 bird species that now have a published record in the manuscript that is shown here on this slide. And that includes the first record of loudness for any species of shorebird, which I was pretty excited about. So the image here is showing source amplitude, which is loudness, of the Arctic species we surveyed, with color indicating the phylogenetic family that the species is part of. And you can see that some species, like snowbunting, are much louder than other species like redneck phalarope. This means that our recorder is likely surveying a larger area for snowbuntings and a much smaller area for phalaropes. And that's really important for us to know because we need that information to correctly estimate survey area for the different species. And as for Q rate, I will say we are still working on it. Those who have spent time observing birds probably have a good sense that getting a sense of how often an individual bird calls is really difficult. And there's a lot of things that go into that. And we're still working on the best way to do it. Last summer, I spent time in the field visually observing birds and counting calls, but that came with its own difficulties. So we're still working on how to use that data. And in the future, there are a couple of ways people are considering doing this. One is individually acoustically IDing birds. So as machine learning and AI models get better, there's some interest within the acoustics community in identifying individual birds from their sounds rather than just identifying a species. And that would help us get around this. As well, we're also interested in tagging small-bodied birds with acoustic tags. There's nothing on the market for that right now, but if there were, we could learn a lot from that invention beyond just cue rates about animal behavior and calling behavior. So we're actively trying to increase awareness and interest in that idea because it would be really cool to get that off the ground. So thank you for listening to all of this information. I hope that you've been entertained and also that I've demonstrated that Arctic species produce fascinating sounds that they use for many purposes, and that passive acoustic monitoring and AI tools can turn these sounds into valuable ecological insights. And we've done a lot so far. There's hopefully a lot more years of this valuable research on the way. As I've talked about, we're still working on estimating density. We're also looking into exploring soundscapes in different areas and the effects of increased human presence in Arctic Alaska. I didn't talk about that project today, but that's also in process. And we're hoping to dive into these questions and more, provided that we're able to keep raising money for this research. And with that, I will say thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Morgan. This is really exciting. You got everyone who trying to answer the sounds and the questions. I was the one that mentioned the ghost because it sounded like a ghost. I can imagine being out there in the dark with those sounds. So just before we go into the questions, because we have the QR code here, if it's between your possibilities to support Manomet in any of the amazing work that we're doing across the Americans, just please scan this QR code and show us a little bit of your support. That would be amazing. And now I'm gonna move forward to the question sections. I have some here. Where do I begin? So fascinating work. What's needed to make acoustic tags?
That's a good question. I will say, admittedly, that I am not a hardware expert. And so I don't exactly know. But generally, I mean, you need something, it has to be really small because the birds are small, and it needs to be small enough that it's not a huge hindrance to them as they're moving around. You need, ideally, you would have like an onboard, really little acoustic recorder that could actually record the sounds that the animal is producing. We've also talked about whether you could use different information like a heat signature or some sort of accelerometry signature to just know when animals are producing sound rather than recording the actual sounds, which would probably be lighter and easier to build, but then you're introducing a little uncertainty because you don't actually know what's going on. You just think you know what's going on because you have a signature. So you also have to test, you have to have some test data so that you know what the signature you're looking for looks like. And beyond that, that's kind of the limits of my hardware knowledge.
That's why you have a team and you can collaborate with other people.
That is why I'm very happy to have a team. Yes.
So I have many. So I have some on my phone, some in the chat that are coming through. Could you distinguish between redneck and Wilson's phalarope? I'm not so sure if this is about sound or visual, but maybe like you mentioned about phalaropes that they were like not making a lot of sound. It was more about visual. So what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, and I will say that that's kind of interesting. I didn't really make that distinction. I would say I think phalaropes are fairly vocal. It's just that they're like the sounds that they make are pretty quiet. So like they're pretty chatty, and I think others who've spent time up there know that at least for some part of the breeding season they're pretty chatty, but they're kind of quiet. So you can really only hear them if you're close by. Right now, The phalaropes we have in our model are red and red-necked phalaropes, and they're combined into a single class because I did not feel confident about identifying one versus the other. They make this, little chert call, maybe you could call it, and it's pretty similar. And we decided to combine them for now. And I don't know Wilson's phalaropes well enough to know whether that would still be the case, or if you think, or if it's different enough. But if you can tell them apart, then you can probably teach a computer to tell them apart. That's what I'll say generally.
And that's why you need more data. And you'll be going
Yeah.
back to the field.
Yep.
Have you identified any bird species through acoustic monitoring that were previously under-detected through visual surveys?
We identified a couple species in the presence paper that we knew were generally up there, but that we didn't detect with Prism. I don't think we've detected any species that are like, whoa, we didn't think that species was even in the Arctic, at least not yet. Um, One thing that I didn't mention about the model is that we do have a couple of classes for sort of undefined sounds. And so something that would be great if someone had the time to do would be to go back through those and look, because it's possible that, if there are species that are coming into the Arctic that weren't there before, that we don't have in our model, they won't get recognized, but they might end up in those sort of undefined classes. Um, and someone might go in and say, hey, there's this species in there. And we haven't seen them in the Arctic before, but not yet.
Oh, maybe soon, maybe this summer. Here's another one. Do diving birds use echolocation? I'm curious because we had unusual freezing on saltwater bays this past winter and wondered how diving ducks maneuvered under large ice areas.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think so because I mean I don't know for sure. I've never heard of that happening. A lot of echolocation, at least that's used by marine mammals and by bats, is much higher in frequency than birds, which at least somewhat I think is because it's produced kind of differently. Like it's not produced with the same sort of vocal box that bird calls are for the most part. Um, yeah, so I don't think so, but I wouldn't say 100% no without looking into it more. That's really interesting.
Yep. Another research question for someone looking for a PhD or postdoc.
Really.
There's another one. It says, how much work would it take to add another species, such as white-rumped sandpiper, to the list of species that Arctic SoundNet can detect?
Yeah, I think we're kind of about to undertake that with Wimbrel because we do want them to be in there. And the reason that they weren't was because we didn't have enough training data. So it kind of depends on your model. I found with our model, like a lot of the training data that we have comes from our recordings specifically, and that seems to work really well. So if we were able to make a bunch of recordings of white rope sandpiper sounds, then we could add a class to the model and retrain it, which is not that difficult. It would take more time to run all the data that we already have back through the model. Like it's a lot faster than doing it manually, but it does take some time. It would take less time with a more powerful computer, but even with, I mean, my computer is pretty powerful and it still does take a bit of time. Um, so I don't know. I mean, it depends on who you had working on it. It's not impossible to do. Like it's totally possible to do. It definitely takes longer than a couple days, but it wouldn't take you a year or something like that.
Uh, questions just keep coming. We have 10 more minutes to answer all of them. So how do you how do you decide where to place recording devices in such a large and remote landscape like the Alaskan tundra?
That's a great question. We So the ones that you saw on the map we've put them where the visual prism surveys were already going to be happening. And the visual prism plots are chosen randomly, or in some areas randomly, but stratified by habitat if we want to make sure that we're covering certain habitats. This summer, we're actually putting out some recorders in a really large, just uniformly distributed grid instead, to sort of see what data we get back from that and whether we think that that might be a good way to uh, deploy acoustic recorders in the future. But in general, the way that Prism does it, like random sampling is a generally a fairly good way to cover a spatial area, and then the random sampling with the habitat stratification is good if you know that, or if you think that just sampling randomly is going to bias your results in some way. So those are also both not bad ways of doing it.
What type of sensor is used, audio moth or another type, and is there directionality?
Yeah, they are audio moths, and I can't believe I forgot to mention that. So I'm glad someone asked. Yeah, we're using audio moths. For those who don't know a lot about acoustic equipment, audio moths are pretty small. They're like this size. I wish I had one here, but I just shipped them all up to the Arctic recently, so there aren't any here with me in California right now. But they are they're nice little recorders, and they're fairly inexpensive, so they're getting more use in a lot of projects, which is cool to see. And the directionality thing is a sort of an ongoing question. Um, on their website, they will tell you that they are omnidirectional, which means that they're picking up sound from all directions. And that is generally true if you deploy them without a case on them. But in the Arctic, you really can't do that if you want to ever use them again, because the instrument will get destroyed. And so you have to put a case on it. And putting a case on it, it's been shown by a couple people, and also we know from our own data, does kind of make it more of a directional signal. So we are working in the density equations in particular on how can we incorporate that, and how can we look at detection range, keeping that directionality in mind, and that we know it's not a circle around the instrument. So we're still working on that. But yeah, they are somewhat directional once you put them in a case.
Oh my God, we need to go through them faster because there are so many great questions.
I'll just say yes
Just
or no.
keep coming. Yes, yes, no, next, no comment. That's gonna be fun. No, let's give them the information. So is simple presence absence data useful in some cases?
Yes, I would say so. And I think one thing that's important about acoustic data is that a lot of people will model a present pseudo absence because you don't technically like exactly know that a species was absent. It just wasn't, it could be there but not producing sound, or it could be producing sound but you didn't pick it up. And so generally, but there's a lot of statistical work out there and different types of models for dealing with like presence pseudo absence data, which is what we did in the paper that we worked on with the presence data. But yeah, presence data can definitely be useful. It just depends on what your project goals are, and Prism has been uh, always been really focused on density and getting abundance estimates, which are really important. And so that's what we're focusing on doing.
Has this promising approach been used for forest birds density tracking or any other ecosystems?
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
Has this promising approach, so they're liking it, being used for forest birds density tracking or in other ecosystems?
Definitely. Yeah, there's a lot of work in different forested ecosystems with acoustics, and obviously that has some of its own benefits, I would say, in some ways that you end up working with a lot of songbird species, and I think that there are some ways that songbirds are a little more predictable than shorebirds in their behavior, but maybe that's just because I haven't worked with them as much. But forest ecosystems definitely have their own challenges because you have a lot of trees that can block sound and other things that can affect how acoustic equipment detects. But it's not it's not insurmountable. There are lots of people who use acoustics in forests.
Let me see. I'm going through questions. How many recordings are generally needed to make the AI model work well?
Also a good question. We were trying to target at least 100 examples for each species. For some species, we ended up with way more than that. For some species, we have left, and we did some data augmentation for that, which is basically like you can take your example and make it like a little bit noisier or change where it is in time a little bit. And so it's kind of a new example without, if you don't have as many examples as you'd like to have. Um, I felt pretty good about using 100, but I think there are definitely, we could have tried it with fewer than that. There are some types of models that are focused on really trying to say like, oh, you only need like five good examples or 10 good examples. The more examples you have, um, the better your model can generalize to when sounds look different. Like on that spectrogram, the Dunlin call looks like that, but if you only have half of it, then it looks different. Or if it's quieter because the bird's further away, then it looks a little different. So the more examples you give the model, the more it can learn to identify your species in different situations.
So I'm gonna choose two more questions to answer and I want to thank everyone because there are amazing questions. It's a very interesting topic. So we will make a social media post with Morgan to answer some of them. But before we go, so we have more homework, Morgan, to do later and answer those questions.
I'm happy to do it. You
Let
have
me
all
see.
asked really great questions.
Yes, it's amazing. I mean, there's so much here. Are there unique recording challenges you've run into while recording in the Arctic, either due to the landscape or the climate, or maybe bears? I don't know.
Yeah, also a good question. There are definitely some challenges. I think a lot of them they're analogous to stuff that comes up in other environments. One is curious animals. Animals will come by. There are some recorders that we lose every summer to bears or other animals, caribou, knocking them over. They come up and there's this piece of rebar where there's nothing else on the tundra, and I think occasionally I've heard like an animal sniffing at the recorder before it gets knocked over, which is really cute, but then not because then you're losing data. But hearing the sniffing noise is cute. And then also, I think the biggest thing that is a bit uh, that can be difficult and that we're also incorporating into density is the wind. There's a lot of wind up there, and if the wind hits the recorder right, it's really hard to hear anything over the wind. So we're working on how do we incorporate that sort of background noise measurement into how we estimate density and other counts of birds because it really affects whether we hear the birds or not. Those are two of the biggest ones that come to mind. It's also somewhat difficult to put the recorders out. We have to drill a hole in the tundra and hammer the rebar in and then put the recorder out. And you need to make your hole deep enough that the recorder stays up and doesn't just tip over once the snow melts. And so uh, there's a variety of complicated little field things, but all field work has that, right? In some way.
Mhm. So for a final question, I don't have it in hand, but I'll try to remember from memory. So now that we understand what your work is and the data that you're collecting and the results that you're showing, what's the application for shorebird conservation? What can we do? What can we know? What decisions can be made with this data?
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of on the broad scale, one of the biggest things is sort of proof of concept. I will not make the claim that I'm the first person to ever do passive acoustic monitoring with shorebirds, but there aren't a lot of people using it for shorebirds yet. And one of the big questions that the Prism team had going into this and that we're still sort of working on because we're still working on the density estimates is can we use this effectively to monitor shorebirds? Um, and based on what we're finding so far, I would say yes. Like they make enough noise that we can detect them that way, at least for some species. Although, like I mentioned, There are some species that are not very vocal, and there's not a lot you can do about that with acoustic recordings. Um, but for vocal species, I would say yes, we can monitor birds this way. So for other shorebird conservation efforts that are focused on monitoring, acoustics is a valuable tool, and we've helped to prove that, I hope. Um, and then also as an abundance estimation method, once we sort of finalize a method for doing that that works well, then we can generate abundance estimates from our data. And those are really useful in understanding critical habitats, in understanding and designating important areas for shorebirds, and in keeping track of how populations are doing over time. So those are kind of a couple of ways that stick out to me.
Thank you, Morgan. This has been amazing. I'm sure everyone would like to rewatch this later once we put it up in our YouTube channel and answered all the questions that were unanswered today in our next social media post or maybe newsletter. We'll see, because there are so many questions and great questions, well, as you mentioned. So to wrap this amazing session, I just want to remind everyone that Manomet Conservation Sciences is a non-profit organization. We are based in the town of Manomet in Massachusetts. And as you've seen here, our work spans throughout the Americas, from the Arctic to the south in Chile and Argentina. So if we can get your support, that's amazing on all of the work that we're doing. And if you'd like to stay connected, just follow us on social media, subscribe to our newsletter, and share our work with a friend or colleague. That always helps. That's a simple way that you can help conservationists, just by spreading the word on the work we're doing and get others to also support our work. So again, thank you, everyone. Thanks, Felix, our interpreter, for being our voice in Spanish. And we'll see you again next month for another webinar. Bye, everyone. Bye, Morgan.
Bye. Thank you.